The forest seemed alive with whispers as the family drove deeper into the winding mountain roads. Trees towered above them like silent sentinels, casting long shadows over the narrow path. The Johnson family had been planning this camping trip for months, a chance to disconnect from the pressures of everyday life and reconnect with each other. Mike, the father, was excited about showing his two kids, Emily and Jack, the beauty of nature, far from the distractions of the city. His wife, Sarah, was happy to support the idea, though she had her reservations about being so isolated. As they approached the camping site near a peaceful lake surrounded by dense woods, an uneasy feeling settled over Sarah. She tried to shake it off. After all, this was supposed to be a weekend of fun and relaxation. But as they pulled into the parking area, an old man in a park ranger uniform approached them. His face was weathered and his eyes seemed distant, as if he had seen things most people wouldn't believe. "Beautiful place, isn't it?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "But I'd be careful if I were you." Mike raised an eyebrow, confused by the sudden warning. "Careful of what?" The ranger hesitated, glancing at the tree line as if expecting something to emerge. "There are stories about these woods, stories of a day. They say it's not like any dog you've ever seen. Not alive, not anymore." The children, overhearing the conversation, giggled nervously. "A ghost dog? Is that what you're saying?" Jack asked, his tone playful but with a hint of unease. The ranger's gaze hardened, and he leaned in closer. "It's not just a story, kid. Some say the dog was once a loyal companion, but something happened. Now, it haunts these woods, and those who see it, well, they're never the same." He straightened up, tipping his hat before walking away, leaving a heavy silence behind him. Mike laughed it off, though the ranger's words echoed in his mind. "Just an old man trying to scare us," he said, trying to lighten the mood. But as the family unloaded their gear, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The campsite by the lake was everything the family had hoped for. The water was calm, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the setting sun. Birds chirped in the distance, and the soft rustle of the trees added to the peaceful atmosphere. The kids were excitedly helping set up the tents while Mike gathered wood for the fire. The earlier encounter with the park ranger seemed like a distant memory, now fading into the background of their excitement. As darkness fell, they all gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. Jack was especially eager to tell the scariest stories he could remember, trying to get a rise out of his younger sister. Emily laughed nervously, glancing over her shoulder at the dense woods surrounding them. Sarah sat quietly, her eyes scanning the trees, feeling that strange unease creeping back. Just as they were about to call it a night, a sound pierced the air, a low, mournful howl echoing through the forest. The family fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound for a moment. "Must be a coyote," Mike said quickly, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Sarah didn't say anything, but her eyes met Mike's, and they both knew that howl wasn't from any ordinary animal. Emily clutched her mother's arm, her eyes wide. "What was that, Mom?" she whispered. "It's nothing, sweetheart," Sarah said, trying to reassure her daughter. "Probably just a wild animal." But the howl came again, this time closer, more distinct. It sent a shiver down all their spines. Jack, trying to be brave, stood up and looked into the woods. "I bet it's just some stray dog, nothing to worry about." Despite his words, there was tension in the air. The family quickly retreated to their tents, the warmth of the fire no longer comforting. That night, as the wind whistled through the trees, strange sounds filled the air. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, and faint growling that seemed to come from all around them. Mike woke early the next morning, shaken from an uneasy sleep. Deciding to shake off his nerves, he wandered out of the tent to gather more firewood. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the lake. The air was crisp, and the forest seemed peaceful again. As he ventured closer to the tree line, something caught his eye. A large, pale dog standing at the edge of the woods, its eyes reflecting the morning light in an eerie way. The dog didn't move. It just stared at Mike, its body unnaturally still. Mike froze, feeling a strange sense of dread wash over him. He opened his mouth to call out, but before he could say a word, the dog slowly turned and disappeared into the fog that clung to the trees. There was no sound, no rustle of leaves, just silence. Mike stood there for a long moment, trying to convince himself that it was just a stray, nothing more. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Shaking his head, he decided not to mention it to Sarah or the kids. They were here to relax after all. There was no need to scare them over something that might not be real. But the image of the pale dog lingered in his mind, refusing to fade. The second day began like any other, with the children playing near the water while Sarah prepared breakfast. The unsettling events of the previous night seemed to have been forgotten, and the forest, bathed in morning light, felt less intimidating. Mike kept himself busy, distracting his mind from the strange encounter with the bow earlier that morning. He told himself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, or maybe a stray from a nearby village. But as the day wore on, the atmosphere around the campsite began to shift. By afternoon, a heavy fog rolled in, obscuring the surrounding trees. It was unusual for this time of day, and it seemed to come from nowhere. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the family decided to stay closer to camp. The woods, once inviting, now felt oppressive and unnerving. Later that evening, as the fire crackled and flickered, strange occurrences began to happen. It started small, a sudden gust of wind that extinguished the flames, leaving them in darkness for just a moment longer than it should have. The fire would come back to life, but the air around them seemed heavier, and even the cheerful glow of the flames couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. As the night deepened, Emily and Jack, who had been running around the perimeter of the campsite, suddenly stopped. Emily stared at something in the distance, her small face going pale. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the trees. The rest of the family turned, but there was nothing there, just the stillness of the woods. Jack, trying to be brave, shrugged it off, but Emily remained quiet, her eyes darting nervously toward the shadowy tree line. As they prepared to turn in for the night, Mike noticed something odd, large paw prints in the dirt near their campfire. They were fresh, leading away from the camp and into the woods. He knelt down to examine them more closely. The prints were larger than any dog or wolf he had ever seen, and they sank deep into the ground, as if the creature had been heavier than normal. "Must have been a big dog," Mike muttered to himself, though he didn't sound convinced. Sarah, standing behind him, had seen the prints too. "Do you think it's the same dog you saw this morning?" she asked, her voice low, almost as if she didn't want to know the answer. Mike didn't respond, but the uneasy look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. That night, the family retreated into their tents again, but sleep was harder to find. The woods felt alive, as if something was moving between the trees, watching, waiting. The faint growling returned, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Sarah sat up, listening intently, her heart pounding. She was sure she heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, circling their camp. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement at the edge of the campfire's light. Mike jumped up, his eyes scanning the area, but again, there was nothing, just the darkness pressing in around them. But it wasn't just Mike who saw it this time. Emily, wide-eyed and trembling, whispered, "I saw it. The dog, it's watching us." Mike's stomach twisted with fear, but he couldn't show it, not in front of the kids. "It's fine," he said, trying to sound calm. "We'll stay inside the tents tonight. Whatever it is, it can't hurt us." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. Something was wrong. The strange dog, the prints, the growling, it all felt too deliberate, too personal. It wasn't just an animal passing through. It was something more, something with purpose. The family huddled together in the tent that night, the sounds of the forest closing in around them. Outside, the growls grew louder, more menacing. The ghostly presence of the dog was no longer just a fleeting glimpse in the distance. It was here, close, circling them like prey. Mike lay awake, gripping the flashlight in his hand, ready for whatever might come next. But deep down, he knew that whatever haunted these woods wasn't something they could fight. It was something much darker, much older. By the third day, the tension in the air was palpable. The once peaceful campsite now felt like a prison, and the forest, which had initially seemed so inviting, had turned into a living nightmare. The family stuck close together, no longer venturing far from the safety of the tents. Even the children, usually so full of energy, were subdued, sensing that something was terribly wrong. That morning, Mike decided to go fishing by the lake, hoping the calm water would ease his fraying nerves. He cast his line into the still water, trying to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept drifting back to the ghostly dog. He hadn't seen it again since the previous night, but its presence weighed heavily on him. The paw prints, the howling, the way it seemed to watch them from the shadows. It all pointed to something unnatural. As Mike stood at the water's edge, something caught his eye. Across the lake, near the thick line of trees, the dog appeared again. It was standing motionless, its pale fur almost glowing in the fog. But this time, Mike noticed something different. The dog's form seemed to waver, like a reflection on the surface of the water, as though it wasn't entirely solid. Its eyes, bright and piercing, locked onto his. Mike froze, his heart racing. He gripped the fishing pole tightly, but his hands trembled. The dog didn't move, didn't growl. It just stared at him, its presence both terrifying and mesmerizing. Mike could feel its intent, as if it wasn't just watching him, it was waiting for something. Something only it understood. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the dog vanished, fading into the mist without a sound. Mike stood there for several minutes, unable to shake the feeling that the dog wasn't just a part of these woods. It was connected to them, bound by something dark and ancient. He rushed back to the campsite, but the feeling of dread followed him. When he arrived, he found Sarah sitting by the fire, her face pale and drawn. "Did you see it again?" she asked, as if already knowing the answer. Mike nodded. "It's not just an animal, Sarah. There's something wrong with it. It's not real, or at least not in the way we understand." Before Sarah could respond, Jack came running up to them, his face twisted in fear. "Mom, Dad, come quick!" They followed Jack to the far side of the campsite, where they found Emily standing near the trees, staring at something on the ground. Large, deep paw prints were etched into the earth, prints that hadn't been there just moments before. But what was even more disturbing was the way the prints stopped suddenly, as if the dog had simply vanished into thin air. "It's following us," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's here." Mike's mind raced. This wasn't just some stray animal wandering the woods. The prints, the sightings, the strange feeling of being watched. It was all connected. The ghost dog wasn't just passing through. It had singled them out, chosen them. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere around the camp grew even more oppressive. The growls returned, but they were no longer distant. The dog was close, circling their camp like a predator, stalking its prey. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent waves of panic through the family. The fire, which had been their source of comfort, now flickered weakly, as if struggling to survive in the face of the growing darkness. Mike stood near the edge of the camp, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees for any sign of the dog. But every time he thought he saw something, it disappeared before he could focus on it. Then, without warning, a loud guttural growl erupted from the darkness, so close it felt like it was right next to them. Sarah grabbed the children, pulling them close, her heart racing. Mike shined his flashlight toward the sound, and for a brief moment, he saw it. The Tao standing just beyond the circle of light, its eyes glowing eerily in the night. Its mouth was open, showing rows of sharp teeth, but its body remained still, as if it were waiting for something. "It's testing us," Mike whispered, backing away slowly. "It wants us to make a move." They retreated into the tent, huddling together in fear. Outside, the growls continued, growing louder and more frequent. The dog's presence was undeniable now, a force of nature that couldn't be reasoned with. It wasn't just a spirit, it was something far more dangerous, something that thrived on fear. Throughout the night, the dog circled the camp, its howls piercing the silence, its eyes ever watchful. No matter how much they tried to ignore it, they couldn't escape the growing sense that the ghost dog wasn't going to let them leave. This wasn't a simple haunting. It was a curse, and they were trapped in it. By the time the last night descended, the family was on edge, nerves frayed and sleep elusive. Every rustle of leaves, every gust of wind made their hearts race. They had tried to pack up and leave earlier, but it seemed as though the forest itself had conspired against them. The car wouldn't start, and every path they attempted to follow led them back to the campsite, as if the woods were a maze they couldn't escape. The realization settled in. They were trapped. As darkness swallowed the forest whole, the ghost dog made its presence known in full force. The growls were no longer distant whispers, but deep, guttural sounds, almost human in their intensity. It circled the tents relentlessly, each low rumble sending a fresh wave of terror through the family. The dog wasn't just watching anymore, it was hunting. Mike grabbed the flashlight and knife, his hands shaking. "We need to stay together," he said, though even he knew there was little he could do against whatever was out there. Sarah clutched the children close, trying to shield them from the mounting terror, though the fear in her own eyes was unmistakable. Suddenly, the growling stopped. The silence was deafening, thick with tension. For a moment, they dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then a loud, unmistakable snap of a branch echoed through the still air, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Slow, deliberate, as if the dog was savoring their fear. Mike shined the flashlight toward the noise, his breath catching in his throat. The beam of light swept across the trees, and there, just at the edge of the clearing, stood the dog. But this time it wasn't just a fleeting shadow. Its full form was visible now, larger than any dog Mike had ever seen. Its fur was matted and gray, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as though the dog existed in both this world and another. The family froze, staring at the creature in horror. It stood still, its eyes locked onto them, its growling growing louder and deeper, reverberating through the air. This was no ordinary ghost. There was a malevolence in its gaze, a hunger that went beyond the need for mere revenge. Without warning, the dog lunged forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. Mike stumbled backward, raising the knife in a futile attempt to defend his family. But the dog's form flickered in and out of sight, as if it were both there and not there at the same time. It moved through the trees like a shadow, its growls echoing from every direction, disorienting them. "Run!" Mike shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the woods. But the children hesitated, frozen with fear. They bolted into the forest, the ghost dog hot on their heels. The woods seemed to close in around them, branches clawing at their clothes as they ran, the dog's growls growing louder and louder behind them. Every time Mike glanced back, he saw its glowing eyes closer and closer, always just out of reach but never far enough to let them escape. The family sprinted through the forest, gasping for breath, their legs burning with exhaustion. But no matter how fast they ran, the dog was always there, a shadow in the corner of their vision, an eerie presence that seemed to toy with them. As they reached the clearing, Mike turned to face the dog, hoping to make a stand. But before he could react, the dog was gone. The growling stopped, and the woods fell deathly silent again. The family stood there, panting, looking around in confusion and terror. Had they outrun it? Had the dog finally given up? Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream tore through the air. It wasn't an animal's cry, but why? It was human, Emily's voice. Mike's heart dropped into his stomach. He whipped around, searching desperately, but Emily was no longer with them. "Emily!" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking with panic. She ran into the woods, but Mike grabbed her, pulling her back. "No, we can't go back!" he shouted, though every instinct screamed at him to find his daughter. But he knew deep down that whatever had taken her, whatever had claimed her, was beyond their reach now. A moment later, the growling returned, this time from directly behind them. Mike turned slowly, dread coursing through his veins. There in the darkness stood the dog once more, its glowing eyes fixed on him, its mouth twisted into what looked like a grotesque, almost human smile. The realization hit him like a cold wave. This wasn't just a ghost. It was something darker, something far older than he could comprehend, and it had no intention of letting them go. They never saw Emily again. Her scream echoed in their minds, a reminder of the terrible force they had crossed. And now the dog wasn't hunting them. It was waiting, knowing that it had already claimed its prize. As the first rays of dawn pierced the dense canopy of trees, Mike and Sarah stumbled back to the campsite. It was eerily still, the fire long since extinguished. The paw prints, now leading deeper into the forest, were the only sign of what had happened. But the dog's presence lingered, hanging over them like a shadow that would never lift. They were the lucky ones. They had survived. But as they looked toward the dense, dark woods, they knew they had lost something they could never get back. And somewhere deep in the forest, the ghost dog waited, patient as ever, for the next family to wander into its domain. The next morning arrived with a chilling stillness that settled over the campsite. The sun, which had once bathed the lake and trees in a golden glow, now felt muted and cold. Mike and Sarah sat by the remains of the fire, their eyes hollow, their bodies motionless. There was no more discussion, no more plans to pack up and leave. They were broken, drained of hope, consumed by the haunting events of the night before. Emily was gone. Her absence hung in the air, a heavy weight pressing down on them. Neither of them dared to speak her name, as if doing so would bring back the terrifying reality they had barely escaped. Sarah's eyes were red and swollen from crying, her hands trembling as she gripped the tattered remains of Emily's backpack, the only piece of their daughter left behind. Mike tried to stand, to make sense of it all, but his legs felt weak beneath him. He couldn't shake the image of the ghost dog, its glowing eyes, the chilling smile on its twisted, unnatural face. It wasn't just an animal, it was something far more sinister. It had taken their daughter, and they had been powerless to stop it. No matter how hard Mike tried to push the memory away, it clawed at him, refusing to let go. After what felt like hours, a sound broke the silence. The soft crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Mike and Sarah looked up, their hearts pounding. A figure emerged from the trees, the park ranger. His face was grim, his eyes heavy with the same burden he had carried when they first arrived. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze drifting over the campsite, taking in the absence of the youngest family member. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He already knew. "You saw it, didn't you?" the ranger asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mike nodded, his throat tight, unable to find the words. The ranger sighed deeply, his eyes dark with a sorrow that came from years of knowing the truth about the forest. "I warned you," he said softly. "But once the dog chooses, there's nothing anyone can do. It's been here for longer than any of us can remember. It doesn't just haunt these woods, it owns them." Sarah let out a choked sob, clutching Emily's backpack to her chest. "But why? Why us?" The ranger shook his head slowly. "It's not about you specifically. The dog, or whatever it is, it's tied to this place. Cursed, maybe. It feeds on fear, on tragedy. I've seen families come through here before, just like yours. Some make it out, some don't." The weight of his words hung in the air. There was no escape from the truth. The ghost dog wasn't just a legend, a story meant to scare people away. It was real, and it had claimed their daughter. The forest had chosen them the moment they set foot in it. Mike clenched his fists, anger and grief swirling inside him. "Why didn't you stop us? Why didn't you tell us to leave?" The ranger looked at him with tired eyes. "I've tried to warn people before, but it doesn't work. It decides, and once it has you in its sights, there's no stopping it." The ranger's words brought no comfort, only the bitter reality of their situation. There was nothing left to do but leave. Leave behind the campsite, leave behind the forest, and leave behind the part of their family they had lost forever. As they gathered their remaining belongings, Mike's eyes drifted toward the woods one last time. The trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, but there was no sound, no movement. Yet, he knew. Deep in those woods, the ghost dog was still there, watching, waiting for the next family to wander into its domain. Mike and Sarah drove away in silence, the empty seat in the back a haunting reminder of what they had lost. The road twisted and turned, leading them away from the place that had taken everything from them. But the ghost dog's presence lingered, a shadow that would follow them for the rest of their lives. As the ranger stood alone at the edge of the campsite, he watched them disappear down the mountain road. His face remained grim, his shoulders heavy with the knowledge that it wouldn't be long before another family arrived, drawn in by the same peace and beauty that had lured the Johnsons. And when they did, the ghost dog would be waiting. For some, the forest was a place of refuge, a sanctuary away from the chaos of the world. But for those who crossed the path of the ghost dog, it was a place of terror, a nightmare that would never end. The card never forgets. It never forgives. It simply waits, patient and eternal, for its next victim. And so the legend of the ghost dog in the woods lives on, whispered among the locals, a story too terrifying to be ignored but too true to be dismissed. The woods are not empty, and it always finds a way. The Johnsons would never return to that forest, but the ghost dog would never leave them, its memory haunting their every waking moment. And somewhere deep in the dark heart of the woods, it waited, ready to strike again. For those who dared enter its territory, there was only one truth. The ghost dog always takes what it wants, and it never ever lets go. The story of the Johnson family became another whispered tragedy in the long line of disappearances connected to the forest. As the seasons changed and new campers came and went, the legend of the ghost dog continued to grow, passed from one mouth to another around campfires and quiet local gatherings. Few believed the tale at first. After all, ghost stories were part of the charm of the old forest. But those who stayed long enough or ventured too deep knew better. For Mike and Sarah, the horror of that weekend never faded. Back in the city, far from the trees that had swallowed their daughter, they tried to rebuild their lives, but something was forever broken. Emily's laughter, once echoing through their home, was now a hollow memory that haunted every quiet moment. Their son, Jack Wang, barely spoke of what had happened, but the terror in his eyes said enough. The ghost dog's shadow lingered over them, a reminder that some things can never be escaped. Every now and then, Mike would wake in the dead of night, his heart pounding, drenched in cold sweat. In the silence of their home, he would hear it, the faint, distant howl of a ninghorn echoing in the back of his mind, as if it were calling to him, beckoning him back to the place where he had lost it everything. And though they would never return to the forest in his nightmares, Mike found himself there again and again, standing at the edge of the trees, staring into the darkness, waiting for those glowing eyes to appear once more. Sarah, too, was haunted by the weight of her loss. She would walk past Emily's empty room, the door always closed now, and feel a chill in the air, as if the ghost dog had followed them home, forever tied to their grief. No amount of distance, no amount of time could shake the feeling that they had been marked, chosen by something ancient and evil. They had left the forest, but a part of it had stayed with them. The town near the woods, however, knew the truth all too well. The locals kept their distance, sharing knowing glances whenever a new family planned a trip to the area. Some tried to warn visitors, just as the ranger had warned the Johnsons. But as always, curiosity and disbelief led people deeper into the forest, where the ghost dog still roamed, waiting for the next unlucky soul to cross its path. The ranger, weathered and tired from years of witnessing the forest's dark secrets, continued his quiet work. Every so often, he would receive reports of strange sightings, glowing eyes in the darkness, the distant sound of growling, and the unmistakable paw prints that led nowhere. He had seen too many families come and go, too many lives lost to the ghost dog's grip. And though he did his best to warn them, there was little he could do once the dog had made its choice. The forest remained as it had always been, beautiful, peaceful, and treacherous. The ghost dog was not just a ghost. It was part of the land, as old as the trees themselves, and bound to its dark fate. No matter how many left the forest, it would always be there, waiting in the shadows, its glowing eyes watching from the edges of the world, ready to claim its next victim. For those who ventured too far, there was one unspoken rule: don't stay after dark. Don't listen for the howls, and above all, if you see the ghost dog in the woods, never look into its eyes. Because once it sees you, there's no escaping. The legend of the ghost dog would live on, a tale told around campfires, dismissed by skeptics, but feared by those who had heard the whispers and knew the truth. It was a warning, a reminder that some places were never meant to be disturbed. The forest belonged to the dog, and it always would. And somewhere deep in the forest, the ghost dog waits. It waits for you.